A little bit about us here at Intellect. We are the host of your webinar today. My name is Raquel Cloyd, and I am the Business Development Manager here at Intellect. In case you aren't familiar with us, we are an award-winning quality management and environmental health and safety software company built on a no-code platform and powered with a robust AI integration. We help companies across a variety of industries to automate their quality processes, reduce operational risk, and achieve their quality and compliance goals. You can follow us on our socials, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. Some of those goals might include compliance with a variety of regulations, ISO, FDA, GXP, OSHA, and more. Highly regulated industries, whether that be in aerospace, med device, biotech, electronics, labs, need a highly tuned quality system to meet their needs and provide peace of mind when the auditor arrives. Intellect has you covered. We have over 30 pre-built quality and environmental health and safety applications to get you started, and you can also build out unlimited custom applications with our no-code platform to meet any quality or business need. If you would like to see a demo of our software, feel free to visit us at intellect.com, or you can even type in the word demo into the Q&A button on your Zoom panel, and either I or a member of our team will contact you after today's webinar. All right, on to the presentation. I would like to welcome back and introduce our speaker today. Kevin Posey is Director of Quality Assurance, Regulatory Affairs, Clinical Affairs at Monogram Orthopedics and has held elected key leadership positions within ASQ. He is a founding member of its innovation division and has led and developed training courses for its membership. He holds an MBA and has 3 decades of experience in quality and regulatory, product development and manufacturing in a variety of industries, including med device, diagnostics, aerospace, mining, and industrial equipment, and has co-authored 2 books on quality management. He previously presented for Intellect on advanced audit interview techniques, and we are very excited to welcome him back today to speak on today's topic. But before he begins, we want to ask you a quick question. How are you currently tracking, calculating, and managing supplier risk? A poll will pop up for you, and you can check all that apply. We'll take a few minutes now to answer that poll question. All right, we've got lots of responses coming in. And we've got about half of attendees who have answered already, so we'll just give it another minute or so. All right, I think we've got a good number of answers here. The results are, let's see, most people are using Excel, I'd say the vast majority, followed by paper-based, so checklists and clipboards. About not quite a third have an EQMS in place already, and about 16% are not currently managing supplier risk, and they're here to learn. So thank you for answering. All right, let's get back to our presentation. Kevin, I will hand it off to you.
All right, thanks, Raquel. I'm excited to talk to you all today. I love this webinar format that Intellect has set up to allow individuals like myself to come in as a volunteer and share some great information with you. And possibly, you got questions on both sides, both as an independent person, independent company rep, using various systems, and then a company support like this. But today's content is about something for you to learn. So thank you for sharing your feedback on that question. And we are going to get then right into this. There we go. One of the key things that I've struggled with in many roles, and if you have questions, we could go back to my background, but I before we jump into that, just give a little more detail. I spent the first 10 years of my career in aerospace. That's actually my background, my undergraduate degree. And then about 25 years, almost 25 years now, in medical device and in vitro diagnostics. And supplier management continues and will probably always be a key factor in successful management of our companies, both from the regulatory as well as the compliance side. And this slide is a nice summary of some of those issues that never seem to go away. You can manage them to one extent or another, but they really never go away. And that's part of the intent of active supplier management. So with this circle, because they tend to self-support as well, but whether it's communication issues, one or both ways, fluctuating quality, delivered quality, as well as fluctuating quality requirements, it can be both. Changes in suppliers for a number of reasons, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Changes in process, disruptions in production. Maybe some of you have heard of something called COVID, and that was a little bit of a production disruption as well as supply chain disruption. Also led to material shortages and then back around our loop. So we're going to touch a little bit on this. I wish we could talk in more depth, and maybe in a future webinar we will, but within the time constraint, we'll at least touch on some of these. So you've got all these problems. What can you do? And this is not new. It's been around, but applying proven supplier risk management methodology is the answer. Now, proven doesn't mean easy, doesn't mean simple, but it doesn't mean that it's really complicated either. And the risk versus the benefit, or the workload versus the benefit, are pretty significant. And we had a nice variation in experience with different types of tools for actively managing supplier risk, or maybe in some cases more passively. And so today's discussion may help you help you by giving you more information to go to senior management to say, hey, we really need to look at an EQMS because we're almost always manpower constrained. So applying more powerful tools helps you get better results with less effort. But the key here is 6 points that I summarized, and I don't think these would be necessarily all inclusive, but I think they hit all the big things. And that's understanding a couple of these points. Is choosing and qualifying suppliers is critical. It's the start of, for most part, with supplier lifecycle management is a cycle. But if you're going to pick a point where you enter it, it's really applying good methodology to choosing and, more importantly, qualifying suppliers. It's critical. But following a risk-based process, you can make that much simpler. Are you going to choose and qualify as a supplier if you're buying off the shelf items from Amazon? No, you're probably not. If you're buying, office supplies, that's very low risk to your med device or aerospace business or other pharma business. Number two is that understanding the supplier is not our employee and they're not our enemy. In most cases, let me back up. In most cases, they're just a hands or arm's length business relationship. In the case of critical suppliers, we'll talk a little bit more about, they are strategic relationships that you really need to treat as a business partner, almost as an extension of the business. But because number three is true, that's us. We depend on our suppliers to perform. The employer enemy focus is that if they don't perform, we're going to punish them, and that ultimately just punishes ourselves. But we'll go into that maybe a little bit more. The same thing is the suppliers depend on us. They depend on you and me to communicate expectations clearly. And I think not unimportant is paying our bills. Some companies, that's not even an issue. You've got a solid procurement process. Others, particularly maybe at a startup stage, may not be. You get the best pricing from smaller customers or smaller suppliers, but they're more dependent on timely payment. So let's not forget that. We need to monitor and measure our suppliers. This is what they call in the quality industry the Hawthorne effect. What you watch, what you measure, always improves. And we want our suppliers to improve. We're going to do that on a risk-based process as well. So I'm not going to be talking with every supplier daily or even monthly or quarterly even, but we'll get into that. And part of that then is let them know how they're doing. For many suppliers, I've been on the contract manufacturing end myself. I appreciate when a customer tells me that I'm doing well and they want to consider me for part of their supply chain awards program. That's not a trivial thing. But again, that gets deeper. So let them know how they're doing. There we go. The key here, and this graphic got a little, I don't know if that shows up. The key thing here, looking at the product level, is start and end with risk in mind. For those in medical device or pharma, ISO 14971 is the international standard. And I'll apologize, I forget the ISO, I think it's 35,000. There is an additional ISO standard for risk management for industry. But risk is a key thing. And assessing it, identifying it, managing it. So in this case, product related risk is where we start, because that's how we are going to choose our suppliers. So in this case, having at least a draft or a released complete bill of materials allows you as the manufacturer to do these make-buy decisions. If we're going to make it, it's not as critical. I may be only sourcing raw components, but if I'm buying it, I'm sourcing it from a supplier. That then begins our supply chain assessment. And how we do this is going to depend on our company's strategy, including their vision and mission. Are we a virtual company solely focused on product development, and we really want someone else as much as possible to manage the supply chain? Perhaps. If we're a very large manufacturer, we're a GE, we're a Johnson & Johnson, and we like being very vertically integrated, then we may want to really look into this in a lot more detail and have things like supplier awards and some very, very nice supply chain dashboards that we share through a portal with suppliers. It's not necessary, but that's something we can do. And I've seen both, or personally experienced both ends of this spectrum. All right, so then that leads right into, once we've established that, is we need to understand our design risk. Again, regardless of what we're producing, what we're designing, almost every industry in some form or another recognizes the use of risk analysis tools like a design FMEA or fault tree analysis, among other tools. Those are not all inclusive or by any means the only ones you could use. They are probably more common, but we need to understand the product design risk. So when I've chosen now to buy components and I've assessed the risk of that component, its failure mode and how it's going to affect performance, it's going to help me establish a risk-based approach to managing that supplier. And particularly if the product risk is going to require reduction or mitigation at the supplier. So do I need them to do more extensive inspection? Do I need them to do performance testing before they release the subcomponents for higher level manufacture? I see some questions popping up. We'll come back to those at the end. But so we start with product risk. And a common approach is to just go with high, medium, low. You can go with a 5 level, but these would be generally your combined risks. Separating out this, whether it's a 3x3 matrix, if you use those, or a 5x5, or other methods to come up with your risk categorization. That we don't get into that here. That's why another area where we could drive deeper. But next. So we already alluded to this, but strategic impact is important. And I like tying this in with Stephen R. Covey, at the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, is if you begin with the end in mind, in this case, thinking about the supplier lifecycle, begin with the end in mind. How do you want your business relationship to come to a conclusion with that supplier, hopefully quite successfully for both of you? But that's then going to drive, hopefully, back to the beginning, back to your supply chain and sourcing strategy that fits in with the company mission and vision. Many of you, maybe the majority of you, maybe even 95% of you, are going to already have a supply chain strategy and a mission and vision. That's fine. But this is a chance for you to take a look at that strategically. Think strategically. What would you change? What would you recommend, or have a discussion, a ground up approach to saying, hey, let's align this a little better. And the key questions to ask out of that is, which suppliers are critical or strategic to our mission or vision? We want to deliver desirable products at a desirable price that is sustainable and everyone succeeds. And then the second one, there's some significant overlap here if you think of it visually as a Venn diagram, but which suppliers can you afford to be single or sole sourced? And we'll talk a little bit of the risk there. There's usually some strategic benefit, but there's also some significant risk when we're single or sole sourced, particularly if it's not geographically co-located. So these now will help drive supplier qualification criteria. And we could probably make a list twice this length if we wanted to. You can use as much detail as you want, but it's really going to come down to generally 3 to 5 that are the most impactful. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. So one we already hit, the strategic importance. how important are they? Is it a commodity or is it a custom design? Is it your design or is it the supplier's design? Both work, both have risks versus benefits, but sometimes when you're working with critical technology, you're choosing the supplier based on their ability to deliver that critical technology. So that can naturally drive you to a sole or single source, and they're not the same thing, by the way. It sounds very similar, but particularly when you get into critical technology, it's not just a matter of single source. They are the only source. That's the difference. Single source means you choose. There are three companies that do it, but I choose to only work with one of them. So single source has some outs, if you will. So the other thing we're going to consider, because cost is always a factor here, cost of goods sold, margins, things like that, are going to have some impact on our supplier qualification. As supply chain professionals, I tend to come at it from a quality or regulatory perspective myself. Compliance to me is as important, perhaps more important than cost. And I always explain that to my C-suite as the cost of one recall or one major field action event in med device or pharma can far outweigh or overwhelm any cost savings, 5% annual cost savings with a company that really can't supply what we need. That gets down to the fourth bullet. These aren't in priority order, by the way. So cost is important, absolutely, but don't make a decision based on cost. I do work my hardest, or work very hard with senior leadership to ensure that cost is not the only factor, not the primary factor. And even if so, that it is a total cost of ownership with the supplier. On-time delivery is important. This will probably be a go-to because it's been such a lesson learned in the last few years, but COVID disruptions really became a challenge for a lot of areas, but on-time delivery was one of them. It was the ability to get things, particularly through ports, through ports of entry from outside the country into the U.S. And this was true for other areas. I know we've got some folks from other countries, so getting things into Mexico, into Canada, into Europe were just as difficult for us as well. But on-time delivery, really critical. Particularly when we came into COVID, I think of the company I was at the time, which is a prior company, produced a high volume, low cost medical device accessories. Really, there's a whole family of them. But certain things, even being vertically integrated, we were dependent because the business approach was to keep minimal inventory. That's a common operating expense management technique. We kept very low inventory, in some cases as low as probably a month's production. And when things were disturbed, the supply chain was disturbed by COVID, and things went to 6 months to a year, sometimes longer lead, that became a very real risk to business continuance and meeting our financial objectives. So on-time delivery, think of those black swan events as well. A couple of these others I don't necessarily think are lower priority, but sometimes they are. Locational logistics, I could use that COVID example again. There's a lot of activity. Actually, I was just reading an article before this. For those who like online resources, supplychaindive.com. It's not suggesting it's recommended. It's perfect. It's the Intellect team went out the way, but it is a source of supply chain information, kind of keeping up with news. And one of those, the top article was how the U.S. is tackling persistent drug shortages, particularly due to supply chain things. And the U.S. government is investing significant amount of money to bring a lot of production of active pharmaceutical ingredients and other things onshore. So yeah, the U.S. government is actively helping us with location and logistics, things that have been moved offshore. Others, business capacity and scalability for growth with your suppliers, I think can be very important, particularly for your strategic ones. Financial terms is more about probably managing our checkbook. Do we have enough negotiating power to tell the supplier that we'll happily pay them in 60 days when they want 15 days? It's an important negotiation, and obviously strategic match is going to be a part of that. And your option. If you're sole sourced and they say no, we'll gladly accept payment in 7 days, you're probably going to do that. But and reputation, both of the supplier and the potential impact on your product and company reputation in the market, tied closely in with things like field defects, recalls, etc., are definitely not insignificant. So a whole lot of criteria, and the goal here is not to be all inclusive or build this into a case study of doing this assessment. But sorry, I jumped ahead just a bit soon there. But some things to think about. So we talked about product risk already, and how we've kind of really fed into the supplier risk. And a common approach is to use 3 levels: critical, particularly for med device, pharma, in organizations or industries like that. Critical is generally seen as the highest, and we define it next, versus major or minor, and you might even say some that are no risk. We'll touch on that only briefly. But assessing and documenting your supplier risk depends on a risk-based approach. And in the industries where there's significant regulatory, which includes things like aerospace, transportation, whether it's rail, automotive, all are fairly highly regulated as well. So don't take what I'm saying as that somehow med device is higher regulated. They're all important. But then you define this idea of a critical supplier. This is a med device and pharma example here, but for example, product sterilization, what we sometimes call end sterilization, is considered by regulation in the US a critical supplier. So you must demonstrate that you manage them at a higher level of risk. There's a number of things that go into that. Contract manufacturing, which is differentiated from just a supplier, which is primarily where your contract manufacturer is doing, putting together multiple sub-assemblies. They are potentially doing you're deferring or delegating quality or supply chain activities to them. That's generally once you're doing that, that's no longer a supplier of a single item or sub-assembly, but you have a contract manufacturer. Contract manufacturing is a critical supplier in med device, pharma, in vitro diagnostics. It ties in closely with the next one, which is if you have outsourced regulatory quality tasks, which could be clinical trial activity, could be someone gathering complaints, communicating with regulatory bodies like FDA or ministries of health in various parts of the world. That elevates a supplier generally to a critical supplier. And third-party packaging and labeling can be another one. It's a little more specialized, but if your product goes through a contract manufacturer, final assembly and release, but now it still has to go through packaging and labeling, in the US, that's generally still a critical supplier. So that's one. That's generally how you get to critical. The rest of it, it depends on the transferred product risk from your risk analysis or your FMEA. It's not aligned directly, so high does not mean critical automatically, medium does not mean major, low does not mean minor. You have to work out in your system using good engineering judgment, good supply chain management technique, which is part of the areas of the art of supply chain, in my opinion, how you're going to manage them. So a portion of high risk product that is sourced is going to at least be major, but it could be critical. And medium is going to generally be some amount in major and minor. Low is probably the only one if it's low product risk, it's probably a minor supplier. But what if you're sourcing something that's low as well as something that's high from the same supplier? Well, guess what? They're going to take on the highest risk level. So you're going to manage them. If it's major because of the high risk product that you're sourcing from them, but the other low risk stuff, generally it's better to manage everything from them at the higher risk. That then, that's a whole segue that could go off into interesting discussion or another webinar, but that's the simple answer for compliance, is treat them at the highest level. Other things that are going to or should be assessed to look at impact on risk is the supplier experience in the particular technology, or even the level of fit, finish, and tight tolerances. a supplier that has great history with building things that are plus or minus an inch in terms of a specification. Now you want to source something that is down to thousandths of an inch, plus or minus 1,000th of an inch. That is several orders of magnitude more difficult, and they may or may not have that capability. Nice thing is you may treat them as critical or major early on until they gain the experience with that. And then you can reassess them later and say, okay, maybe they've got a good handle on it, and they're maybe minor or maybe major but with not the same level of controls. It's another discussion is you don't treat all major or critical ones exactly the same. You have some flexibility. If you're buying things from a catalog, off the shelf, Amazon, or any of the numbers, Granger, I think of MasterCard, things that are kind of off the shelf, nuts and bolts are generally minor. You're not going to audit them, for example, their risk, because they actually are just distributors. So we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on that, but there's definitely precedent for treating them as minor and very minimal supply chain management. So checking all those criteria, you're at risk of getting a little deep here, but a common way to now take all those inputs, rank suppliers against one another to choose the best. If you have that luxury, that flexibility, I can set up 3 to 5 criteria that are the most important out of everything we've talked about, both from a product risk as well as the supplier risk. Determine a weighting for each of the criteria and break up. So a common one is to just take 100% and break it down. So you apply a certain amount of risk or weighting to each criteria. You could also use ordinal weighting, which is this one is sometimes a little easier. It's when you're thinking about a category, you might not think, is it 5% or 10%? I get confused. And I'll say honestly that what I run into is sometimes companies will finagle with the final percentages to kind of get the answer they want. Ordinal weighting just forces you to say, I've got these suppliers, which one is really the best? And say, all right, the best gets a 5, second best gets a 4 or a 3, and so on. So you're ranking against each other in the category rather than weighting. But then using a point scale for each of the categories, you got a couple different options. You can use a 5-point scale, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can go 9 points using odd numbers, 10 points using even, and use your creativity, just different ways. The goal of higher numbers is they multiply and you get more separation. With a 5-point scale, it's not uncommon to have one supplier, let's say they get a 15, the next supplier gets a 14, but are they really the same? If one supplier gets a 85, another supplier gets a 65, it's a much clearer answer. You rate it on multiple, but so that's the main thought process there. And then you finalize in a weighted decision analysis table, which if you look that up, if you're not familiar with it, that kind of combines all these into a nice table that's very numerical analysis based, and tough to argue with. Your criteria, they can argue with the weighting maybe, but that's what you get. That's one tool. I'll put a little more detail on that if you're not familiar with the weighted decision analysis table and how that can be used to choose or evaluate suppliers and choose ultimately first and maybe second place. That's one of the other outcomes that I didn't put in here is your results don't mean that you only pick one. If your supply chain strategy is you want to have dual source so you can continue the competition. Good-natured competition, I guess is how I clarify that, because it's not just about price. Most people think of competition as like, hey, I've got supplier B that will undercut you by 2%. Can you match that? That's a place perhaps in some of your with some of your suppliers, but think of the full cost of ownership of those suppliers. Price is just one part of it. All right, we do it on time here, 12:30. Quality culture is an important part of all this. And these are some great quotes. You could insert the ones that you like more than others. Ford was famous for saying quality means doing it right when no one's looking. That's kind of not like culture. That's character, if you will. Edgar Schein said how we perceive, think about, and feel about things. Larry Sand said culture is not an initiative. I like that. Culture is the enabler of all initiatives. It is the place, the heart, if you will, of the company that is the engine behind all positive change as well as negative change. You could go both ways. Marvin Bauer said it's the way we do things around here. I think there are stronger ways to say it, but he's absolutely right. And then this guy I've never heard of just said, quality is just good business sense. That's my summary. I get challenged on a regular basis across multiple companies like, yeah, this is going to take more time and effort to do it this way. And the general answer is, if it's not specifically called out as a compliance requirement by FDA or some other company, you really pay attention to it. It's based on good business sense. If it's not good business sense, then you've got an argument to say, and if it's not good business sense and it's not a compliance requirement, we probably shouldn't be doing it. But ultimately, culture is important. This 5V or VV-VOOM, however you like to pronounce it, is a good way to look at that in kind of a simple methodology. And you got the reference down here if you want to look that up. I do like this, and that mnemonic of having everything starting with V. It all starts here at the top with vision. We talked about that earlier. What is our strategy, our goals? Visibility, then it becomes about ultimate culture is driven by your CEO or your top executive at a site. Because usually it's someone local. I think in my last company, couldn't be better described. We had a strong CEO, but the general manager, he didn't have that title, but really was a senior operations executive running that site. His presence, his approach to going to Gemba was what really drove that site and made it a very high-performing organization, one of the best I've ever worked for. And that he was definitely the line workers, what line workers would see, they'd see what he prioritized and react to that. And he prioritized people, among other things. That was pretty significant. Vigilance is important when we come into the headwinds, use a sailing analogy. That requires grit, focus, follow through, and accountability. Anybody remember a time when that was in recent past where that was important? Absolutely. And that leader in particular, that's where I was working during COVID. I'll just, summarize it by saying we were one of the most successful companies and sites to come through COVID at the end, both in terms of personnel as well as financial performance. So I think it definitely backs up these so far. Credibility in that example, absolutely there. Passion, authenticity, and motivation are critical. And this is what we could go off on a different tangent here, but this is what differentiates, in my mind, a manager versus a leader. Leader has to inspire and really bring the team into, I guess, direct, trying to blank on the word here, but really drive excitement about the company. And it can't be that false, hey, we're a family. Yeah, there's some positive emotion around that, but it's about aligning. I think of more of maybe a rowing crew. If everybody's rowing to their own tune, it doesn't matter how long the person in the back of the racing boat is screaming for everybody, work together, work it. You really have to inspire and motivate. That goes then, the values, the behavior I've just been talking about, the ethics, and ethics are really most obvious during these times of where grit and focus are necessary. Some people say, ethics are what you do when no one's looking, but in the business environments, they become a lot more visible. Humility and empathy in leadership, particularly, I think, is so important in driving quality culture. Our success is not about me. At that company, I had a larger department, a lot of several managers, several supervisors working for me. It wasn't about me. It was about me and inspiring and really getting them behind senior leadership. I'm really the conduit to senior leadership. But all right. So culture is a big part of this, and this being a nice little segue into culture, apply it to supply chain management, supplier risk assessment. That's really important. So we got another poll question here, and you can't cheat and use my examples. Well, you can if you want, but question is, in the past 3 years, have you had a significant disruption to business due to a failure to manage supplier risk? And thanks, Raquel, for popping that up. We're just looking for yes or no. In the Q&A, we can maybe get into some examples, but.
Yeah, this will kind of segue into the next part of Kevin's presentation. So we're curious to know from everybody. So I think we've got close to we've got about 2/3 of everyone attending answering. Great. Just a few more minutes, or not minutes.
Appreciate the interaction. That's great.
Yep.
All right.
I think we're about ready there. So looks like
62% of you have yes. The 38%, you think about this. So is it that you didn't experience risk, or you successfully managed the risk, so you avoided the disruption? That's I guess an important clarification. We could have gone to a second question. So most of us say, had some level of disruption, but how you got ahead of the problem and actively managed it may be a part of that. But let's then go to the next point here. So I got a couple of case studies. I didn't want to pull anything from my current company, because this is not about where I work. We want this to be more broadly applicable. I picked a few examples here, and the first one here, talking about supply chain risk. For those in aerospace, you may already know about it. And I started my career there, but I said almost 25 years now I've been in medical device, so a little disconnected. But what I didn't realize is back in 2007, when Boeing was working on releasing the first production 787 Dreamliner, so they were still in development, but early production, they had a pretty significant issue. And I have the link here, so I just kind of summarize it. Feel free, it's a free link, no paywall or anything, to pull this up, because there's a wealth of information in this case study that we don't have time to go through here. But the end result was they had no experience at that time. So Boeing being probably a classic example of historically very vertically integrated, they, with the 787 Dreamliner, partly for cost and I think some other reasons, went to a more dispersed or international supply chain. And it kind of bit them in the so-called posterior there initially. And the end result was that the first aircraft delivered was $10 billion over. The total project really was $10 billion over budget. I'm sure they still had a committed cost for the first customer, and it was a 3-year delay in delivery, which is pretty significant when you're talking about commercial aircraft. In one of the deeper commentaries, one of the interesting things they had to do as far as their supply chain resilience is they had spec'd out some particular connectors, bolts, nuts, screws, etc., that the overseas supplier had trouble meeting the quality for. And what Boeing ended up having to do is they actually went and sourced those initially from Ace Hardware and Home Depot, believe it or not. Now, eventually they did fix that. They found a supplier. I would assume here, because I with not working at Boeing, not having the direct hands-on experience, that what they sourced from those suppliers met spec. But it's an interesting consideration, is 787 Dreamliner, which I think is spec'd out for like over 350 passengers, being supported in the air from items you'd find at your local Ace Hardware bolt bin. But they were able to recover, and it became a significant case study where they dramatically changed process. So it's a very good case study. So I'm glad I was able to find a publicly available source there. Other examples, the second example here anyways, is back in 2011, so a little later, back orders for particular paints that Ford and Chrysler were dependent on for high-end vehicles. And their problem was there was a single, so actually sole source of a pigment that some of you who are into cars or into paint may know, but it was the additional pigment that actually provided a very brilliant finish for the paints. So some of of course, they're back now. They've been in production, but that kind of sparkle finish, and I'm not giving the full technical term because I'm not a paint expert, but the plant that produces is actually a Merck chemical plant. Actually, ended up being shut down because of the earthquake and tsunami that led to the Fukushima nuclear incident. If you Google that, there was a substantial impact beyond paint on particularly Japanese auto industry, because there were quite a few auto parts manufacturers for things like what would be like Honda, I'm drawing a blank on here, Mitsubishi, trying not to get any Korean ones in here. Anyways, Toyota, I'm missing Toyota. They were significantly impacted by the ability to, or lack of ability to get things. But in this case, the pigment, there were no alternate sources, so it delayed production of autos with that high-end paint. This one I didn't find a more detailed example on, but if you think about it, if you are a Ford or Chrysler executive and you're told the most awesome looking paint jobs are just not going to be available for 3 years, what's your option? One, you just discontinue that paint option until it comes back, or look for some alternatives that maybe aren't as good. But you got to think about supply chain resilience. Do I just stop selling Fords and Chryslers? Of course not. But no one, this is what we talk about as a black swan event, an earthquake and tsunami that takes down a significant part of the supply chain for an extended period of time, is a possibility. Next example here, if you kind of focus on product risk, the Boeing Dreamliner is also a good example of product risk, so we won't go over that as well. And of course, the 2019 to 2021 is still ongoing a little bit. You had a couple of examples. Labor shortages, from my experience, was a significant one, where we had significant, people were either actively sick, quarantined, or just flat afraid to come to work. They would prefer to take whatever payment was available. And in general, I'm not even talking about within the US, but that could include that. So you couldn't get the experienced labor, and temporary labor, when it could be found, was possibly not as capable. So real example at the prior company, where it's something as simple as cardboard boxes for packaging material, the quality of that work was noticeably reduced. Some of it was due to components like what went into the glues that actually held cardboard boxes together. The other was operation of things like the presses that cut the cardboard boxes to the right size so that it could be folded to the right shape and would maintain its structural rigidity, which is important. It's actually something I found out the hard way. I had to become very involved with what does it mean to have a specific strength rating on a box. When you're shipping medical devices in boxes, they have to pass ship testing. And if all of a sudden you're getting boxes that claim to be the same rating but aren't, it's a quality issue. The other one, it's not specific to COVID timeframe, but in sourcing anything from mainland China, Chinese New Year brings labor turnover every year. I had a Chinese executive explain to me one year that most years it's something on the order of 30% of employees that go back inland or they go home for Chinese New Year, because it's a 2-week period. 30% of them never come back. They just say, I'm going back to living in my small village. So how do you deal with 30% turnover every year in some areas that are relatively high experienced labor? That example was injection molding of medical device components, including assembly of finished devices. And they would say, every Chinese New Year they would face probably about a month of quality issues with basically getting new employees trained up. They were trying to continue to meet demand, but would have some significant scrap and rework the month or two after Chinese New Year, which is part of the culture there. The last one I would a little general. We could talk about some specifics maybe in the Q&A, or this is a great opportunity to have a follow-on webinar in this area. But I do want to bring us to a close here pretty soon. So we have some time for Q&A. But the more complicated and globally distributed your supply chain is, the more difficult it's going to be to manage. One of those is, so it's slow to respond to design change necessary to manage risk. If you become, and this was an issue at a different company, we'd find an issue based on complaints in the field, and we'd say, well, all right, we need to make a design change. Well, this is actually that same company in China. We were sourcing things, and for minimum order quantities, leveraging all the logistics to get the lowest cost, it was not uncommon to have on the order of 50 to 100,000 units made to the old revision already in transit to our distribution center. So when we became aware of an issue, that's the first thing we would have to do is go to the distribution center once it arrives. Everything's quarantined. You're talking dollar cost of inventory, lost, not able to fulfill orders, and pay me and a team of people to go through and inspect or segregate every box that was suspect. And yeah, it was we saved some money, but if you looked at full cost, full supply chain cost, that happened several times a year. So that was pretty significant. You could also have things that just flat go obsolete in transit. If you got that much, if you're taking advantage of ocean-based shipping, containerized shipping, that means you're putting more in a container, more on a boat. Stuff happens. And then when you've got, worst case, the first bullet was really about we've got a design change, so I need to catch everything that's pre-design change and either rework it or scrap it. But what about if all of it is subject to recall and we have to account for everything in the supply chain? In medical device and pharma recalls, that's all product that's still in our control, but we still have to account for as much as possible every last unit, particularly in a class 1 recall. So we have to know how many are produced, how many are in our control, and how many we are trying to get back or accounted for from customers. So really complicates your recall process and accounting for it. So and that's just a few of the points. All right. So here we are to the summary, and we got about 10 minutes. So it's a little bit cliche, but I still love this. Risk is everywhere. If you don't manage it, it'll manage you. So plaster it on your wall, tattoo it on your arm. I don't know, whatever it takes to remember it is. If you're not managing your risk, it's going to manage you. In the case here, we're talking about supplier risk. So same thing applies there. Assessing and managing that risk. It reduces the risk. It doesn't drive it to zero, but it does reduce the risk of being non-compliant with the regulatory bodies, FDA, Health Canada, MHRA in UK, etc. Could be FAA if you're aerospace. Could be Department of Transportation if you're dealing with automotive or rail transport. But assessing the risk reduces potential of getting bad product. That's generally our first line. Is we don't want to deal with bad product coming to our dock. I think as important, possibly more important, depending upon the time frame and the criticality. What if you don't get your product? That could be best case, it could be just late. Worst case, it could be you're not going to get any product for an extended period of time. So we want to manage that. And the outcome of this process is a list of risk controls that are needed. So perhaps requiring inspection at the supplier. They provide an inspection sheet and pass-fail before they ship your product. It's just one option. And then keeping track of key performance indicators so that you know how things trend. Because any one shipment is just a point in time. You want to see trends. Are things improving? Are they regressing? Things that are continuously good or continue to improve, you want to reward those suppliers, right? Reward the good behavior. The ones that are failing, do you punish them? I would suggest no, you want to help them. Even your medium risk or possibly even low risk suppliers, help them do better. They may not care. If they don't care, that's the life cycle process where you start looking at a replacement supplier. But if the supplier is trying, and you're going to know that mostly by interacting with the people as well as impacted by their culture. So if we do all this, what does it do? What does it allow? It allows us to manage supplier risk to maintain overall company risk at an acceptable level. And that's a key thing. Risk is never zero. You can't afford zero risk, but you can manage it at an acceptable level and therefore maximize financial performance, pick your financial metric, whatever it is. And I think important to us as employees of the company, we want the company to be stable. So doing that helps us take care of all those things. High-end statements, but I think they're valid. If you've made it this far with us, Success Baby says, fist pump, good job. I know you're going to have a lot of questions, and I'll turn it back over to Raquel for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. A lot of questions that we've got for everyone today. Kevin, if you wouldn't mind forwarding one more slide over.
Okay.
Thank you. So before we begin with the Q&A, and this is your chance to, if you haven't already, enter your questions into the Q&A portion of your Zoom panel, not the chat. If you'd like to get a hold of Kevin after this session, his contact information is below, including his email and where you can find him on LinkedIn. No need to rush it and write it all down because we will send out this slide deck as soon as possible after the webinar. I also invite you to join us for our next webinar on Wednesday, January 31st at 12 noon Eastern, Managing Cost of Quality in an ISO 9001 Facility, Hidden Risks, Opportunities, and Realities. You can register using that link at Intellect.com. And again, if you would like to see a demo of Intellect's QMS software, please either type in demo into the Q&A portion here on the Zoom panel or visit us at Intellect.com. All right, let's jump into Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Let's see here. How to find the reputations of potential suppliers from industries that you're unfamiliar with?
Yeah, great question. I guess this may sound oversimplified, but I would start with looking at their presence on social media, looking at their website. If they present a more polished professional image, it's not definitive, but it's a good start. Before you select them as a supplier, engaging in some communications with the supplier, and you don't have to. I'm not saying you have to tell them that you're looking at them as a supplier, but I think that's valid. But see how professional they are in their communications. That is a proxy or an indirect representation of their presence, their reputation is what we're talking about. But it's a great way to start.
All right, great. Next question. Should a supplier holding an FDA or ISO certification be categorized as low risk?
It definitely reduces your risk. So that's an excellent question. And the longer answer is it depends, but I usually have come at it a slightly different way, which is my preference is I will only work with, I'm an FDA regulated industry. So ideally, and I'll even caveat a little bit, my contract manufacturers, they have to be FDA registered. So it's a twofold without going into too much depth, but I prefer that. And there's, as far as desired supplier qualifications, that kind of works your way down. So for me, it would be FDA registered, QMS audited. Next would be ISO certified, either specific 13485, which is quality system for med device, or ISO 9001 for general industry. But they're pretty close, so I work with those. If I have a sole or single source supplier that has none of the above, I will treat them as higher risk. So yes, that's the other way of coming around of saying, I'm going to assume you're high risk if you don't have those until you prove otherwise.
All right, thank you. Next question. Any suggestion on how to mitigate the risk of sole source? We only have one supplier for our key technical part globally, cannot find another substitute.
Yeah, that is a huge question. And you're potentially fighting against things like intellectual property as well. If they're sole source because they have a lock on the process or the technology. The only way you can look at it is to design around it. And that's usually not healthy for a strategic relationship with that supplier. And I can tell you, without giving away any details, in the current company, we've worked against some of that, where some of the technology is so pervasive, so universal, but it's controlled by one company that you can't differentiate very effectively against other companies with an offering without designing around it. But when you do that, they're not as friendly on terms, pricing, delivery. It's not that they go, I guess, it's really probably the appropriate way to think of it the other way. They are a lot more amenable to working with you when you're working with them. But if they know you're looking at an alternative, they're just not as easy to work with. So it's a tough situation, and there are a lot of companies. My current company is mostly a product development focused, but it's in many ways it's mostly software based. So the hardware we tend to be subject to that situation that you're talking about, and it is not a simple problem for sure. But the easy to say, hard to do option is design around it. It's probably going to be a longer term solution. It's not going to happen in a year. It might be 3 to 5 years. But if you're aware of something, email me, let me know, or text me on LinkedIn. I'd like to find out if someone has found a way to more effectively work around single source with IP control.
Okay. Next question, we have a few that are related to external calibration companies.
Yes.
How would you rate risk of those? How would you evaluate them?
You guys, like, you're reading my mind. I've seen a couple different approaches. My personal approach is they're not critical suppliers, generally because they have to be certified on their own. It's ISO 17025 or 17050. But I will still keep them on my supplier audit program. So like with what I would generally do with a medium risk supplier, which is where I would put calibration services vendor, is let's say that my procedure says I'm only required to audit them every 3 years, once every 3 years. I might do my services vendor, my calibration vendor, a little more often. Maybe it's every 2 years, just because we depend so heavily on their results. But I have not run into a situation where it was a problem. Those vendors are very receptive. They face a lot of audits, but I don't think they're critical or high risk.
Okay, good. Time for just a couple more questions.
Yep.
Do you do you limit supplier feedback to top 10 suppliers or suppliers of critical materials?
Great question. What I recommend, and it depends a little bit on the size of your supply chain. If you've only got 10 suppliers, why not evaluate them all? If you've got 2,000 suppliers, you're going to have to make a risk-based decision. And the rule of thumb I use is critical suppliers, I do quarterly KPIs, cost, performance, delivery, plus whatever else is important. They generally are kind of subsets of quality. So if you have them tracking things like their in-house scrap and rework rates, which I recommend if they will provide it, I would do that for my critical ones quarterly. For my medium risk suppliers, I would do it annually. And that's what I would call maintenance metrics. If you have an event that suggests that a medium risk supplier has a quality issue, you may need to step it up. So give yourself that flexibility to say, yeah, they're medium risk, annual normally, but they've got a history. So for the next year, I'm going to do quarterly, at least quality updates. And then my low risk is generally critical and medium. I'm sorry, critical or high risk. I would communicate that to the supplier every time. Your low risk, I think you've got a lot more flexibility. There's going to be a high percentage. They don't care about your metrics. Again, you're buying from distributors. They don't care about what you think about the source material. So if they're sending you on something from someone else. So generally those are, there's no follow-up, there's no metrics. I don't engage in any metrics. Again, unless something very specific happens. I've had material coming from McMaster-Carr that was not what was build in the box. There was supposed to be grade 8 bolts, for example, because it's a high stress and usage, and it was not. It was grade 8. It's a pretty low grade issue, but it's critical to me from from a product risk.
All right, we're running a little bit over, but we have time for one last question.
I've got time.
Can you please expand on why cost usually wins over compliance and how we can change that behavior?
Because typically, and I don't mean this in a negative way, our CEOs and CFOs are numbers focused. They are, particularly in a public company, they need to deliver financial performance. So cost impacts that first. So our supply chain cost impacts that first. And it's also in terms of a commitment to the market, the commitment to deliver savings or reductions in those costs are also the easiest for them to commit to. So I think those are positive reasons, but it's up to us as supply chain professionals, quality regulatory professionals, to educate them. It may not be something you talk about in a quarterly earnings call with the market, but balancing all of those with the full cost of quality. This cost of quality seminar coming up is probably a great one. Raquel, I don't know if you can tell us who is presenting that, but my experience with a fellow ASQ instructor who is well known for cost of quality has some great materials on that, and applying it to supply chain cost is a bit of a stretch, but it's a great thing you can do to show management that per unit cost is not the only cost.
Yeah, definitely. Doug Wood is.
Oh, great! That is who I was thinking of.
Yep.
Doug is an excellent instructor. He has years, if not decades, of experience. When his book came out, it was one of the first things I bought from him. Excellent work. So yeah, you'll enjoy Doug Wood if you guys that are interested. He's a great speaker. I'll tell you, I'll be attending. So
awesome. Great. And then we'll follow that up, just so everyone knows, in February with a demo of our cost of quality application, which is part of our QMS solution. So that will be kind of the subsequent webinar after that. But thank you so much, Kevin. We have so many more questions. If you have questions for Kevin, feel free to reach out to him via his email or on LinkedIn.
If you can capture them, Raquel, you can forward them to me by email, and I can see how we might respond to them offline.
And I think we have, a lot of interest for a follow-up webinar, on supplier management and risk. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much again, Kevin, for coming back and speaking to our audience today. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, Raquel.
Thank you.